Hey, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of Aaron's Indie View. Today, I'm not actually interviewing anybody. I'm just going to do a quick and hopefully short review of the most recent book that I've read, Barry Windsor-Smith's Monsters. I have to imagine Barry Windsor-Smith is a name that will help date you if you're a comic book reader. Either you know who he is and you think he's one of the most profound artists who's ever worked, or you've probably never heard the name, or maybe you've heard it in passing with reference to some 80s work. Just a quick bio. Barry Windsor-Smith started work at Marvel in the very late 60s. I think his first work was an issue of the X-Men before it was canceled and was in limbo for like 10 years before it got relaunched as the all new, all different X-Men with like Chris Claremont working on it in 77. So that's how early he was into the comic book industry. In the early 70s, he worked on the Conan the Barbarian comic, which is kind of what he made his career. Like his first like big work that he made his name off of. I have a few collections of his Conan work, showing one right here. The Savage Sword of Conan was actually the spinoff of the first series that he did with writer Roy Thomas. And then one of his other notable works is the Wolverine origin that he did, originally published in Marvel Comics Presents as the origin of Weapon X, which was eventually collected into a very popular graphic novel. And it's one of the most profound and influential books that I've ever read as a young kid. I've spoken on it at length about how much I love and was influenced by Barry Windsor-Smith's Weapon X. But I think it's probably one of the most, it's one of his more popular works that a lot of people, if you know Barry Windsor-Smith, you probably know him from that. And he's somebody who drifted in and out of the comic book industry. I think he was perennially dissatisfied working for Marvel Comics, which anybody who's familiar with the comic book industry should not be surprised to hear that. I would mention him in the same sentence with monumental creators like Jack Kirby and Alan Moore, who had a lot of high hopes and a lot of big ideas for the medium of comic books, and was ultimately destroyed and or just dissatisfied and broken by the industry as a whole. But that's really neither here nor there. I mostly want to talk about Monsters as a book. It's a significant book because the book itself states that it's the first published work Barry Windsor-Smith has had in 16 years. Even that is a little bit of like a clever twist on what's really gone on, because I think really the last thing he's really done was in the late 90s. He did a book for Dark Horse Comics called Barry Windsor-Smith's Storyteller, which was then subsequently collected into hardback volumes by Fantagraphics. Books like The Young Gods, which is also an excellent book, which I suggest, although it is unfortunately unfinished. And the final book was another series that he was doing in Storyteller called The Paradox Man. So Monsters, just a little history. I've been going on at length about Barry Windsor-Smith's history, but a little bit of history. It began in the 80s as a Hulk story, like the Incredible Hulk, Bruce Banner, the Hulk, etc., that he was going to pitch to Marvel. And for whatever reason, it didn't go at Marvel, and the story stuck with him. My first impressions is that I liked it quite a bit. And in many ways, this story feels a little bit dated. It feels like something that would be released in the 80s, which is not surprising because that's when it was originally conceived. And it's also something that he's been working on and off for the last 30 years since then. I would actually say that it reminded me a lot of the 1982 X-Men graphic novel, God Loves, Man Kills by Chris Claremont and Brent Anderson. And that's that's like kind of a double-edged sword because I didn't really love God Loves, Man Kills. I think it had some of I think Barry Windsor-Smith's monsters have some of the similar problems in that it leans a little too hard into the attempts at serious literature, and it eschews all of the pulp superhero trappings that would normally be associated with the characters. That's the problem I had with the X-Men graphic novel. The advantage that Monsters has is that it's not actually a Hulk story. If this were a Hulk story, I can imagine a Marvel editor sitting there, and it's the 80s, so he's probably smoking a cigar, and he's just saying, where's all the action? Why isn't the Hulk fighting with things, And that doesn't really happen in this story. It's really character focused, and it's really focused on the relationships and the character drama, which definitely works. I think it's really deep. I think it is I really like the way the story is woven together, the way it starts about Bobby Bailey, who is the character who becomes the monster. And then there's all this backstory and all these other characters that kind of get tied into it. And it unfolds really nicely. It is kind of long. It does feel like this is a story. This does feel like a magnum opus kind of story from an artist who is not necessarily hindered by an editor, and so he just kind of has this free reign to just kind of just go and really get into the character development. So take that for what it's worth. This isn't going to help the accusations of the story being dated, but in many ways this sort of feels like a combination of the character of the Hulk, but as written by Stephen King, like an 80s Stephen King. I definitely got the Shining vibes from this. With a few superficial aspects of the characters, definitely kind of felt like that. Like it's a little bit of, I don't want to call it a horror, like a horror genre, but there was like a supernatural seriousness to this that if it were an actual superhero comic book that was released monthly, it would probably come off as a little cheesy, but the tonally with this prestigious graphic novel release, it comes off more like a Stephen King horror. In many ways, this book feels like it's like a strange generational divide, because a lot of page space is devoted toward one of the characters' diary entries and journaling, which is beautifully rendered in handwritten cursive, which I just have to assume that anybody born after like the year 2000 isn't going to be able to read cursive, so they're not going to get this book. I can imagine a lot of young kids who maybe like superhero characters or comic books as they've experienced them through video games and movies, and who maybe want to get into reading some books but who don't actually like to read. They're going to start, if they look at this book, they're going to open randomly to some pages and they're going to see cursive, and they're not going to want to read any further because they literally don't know how to read cursive. And maybe that's a detriment to the book, but that's also one of those, like, I don't really care because I'm an old crabby old man, and like, screw the kids. But that was something that I thought of when I was reading this. I was like, man, kids are not going to be able to read. They're literally not going to be able to read this because they don't know how to read cursive. I don't know if I've expressed that enough, but there we are. Going back to what I was saying about it feeling dated, that's also backed up by the fact that it actually does take place in the 80s. Like, this is a story about families that grew up during World War II, and then there's a generational like kids that were born out of that, and now it's the 80s and they're adults. So it is a little strange that it's being published in the year 2021, and it feels like something that should have been published in like 88, 89 at the latest. I think it's definitely something that if you're interested in the medium of comic books and you want to see a master really working his craft, I think this is a book worth looking at for sure. One of the things that stood out to me was the lettering. This has always been something when I read Barry Windsor-Smith's books, is because he's somebody who comes from like the old school style of comics. Like again, this Barry Windsor-Smith is an older fella, and he started working in the late 60s and he's been working in the 70s. And I'm really impressed with the way he controls the flow of the page through his lettering. uh, I'm speaking as somebody who's produced comic books and letters his own comics, and I'm extremely paranoid about the way that readers will be able to follow the page and follow the lettering. And I'm always, whenever I read a Barry Windsor-Smith book, there's a lot of dialogue heavy stuff in there, but it's not that style of widescreen comics that became popular in the 2000s with Brian Michael Bendis and Warren Ellis, etc. Like Barry Windsor-Smith really does come at it from an old school comic style layout, and it's incredible to me that he can have a page that's built off of a 9-panel grid and still chock full of lettering and dialogue, and it really does flow effortlessly. And it just, to me, it reads really naturally. I do wonder how somebody who hasn't grown up reading those style of comics would be able to follow it, but I imagine, again, just like a master of his craft, I imagine that any uninitiated person would be able to follow it. What are my final thoughts on Monsters? I do recommend the book. It took me a while to read. I devoted several days, well, actually almost a week to it, just reading it kind of off and on. It has a very slow pace. It's a really relaxed pace. It takes time to delve into the characters like really, really deeply, than more than a way that if this was published as like a monthly comic book, I imagine there would be a lot tighter uh, restrictions on like what you need every month. You got to have this much action, this much character development, this much whatever. So in that way, it does feel like a graphic novel as opposed to a collection of an ongoing monthly comic book story. And that's one thing that I really appreciated about it. So it does have a slower, relaxed pace, but it feels really natural to the story. It flows really evenly. So yeah, if you're somebody who is interested in comic books and comic art more specifically as a medium, and to see what really can be done with it, I totally recommend it. And I will still add the caveat, in many ways it does feel a little dated. It feels like a book that should have been released at least 2 decades ago, at least, if not more. But I'm glad that we got it now, and I'm glad that I can read it, and I'm glad that Barry Windsor-Smith is still doing stuff. I wish he would do more, but that's the artist life. Hey, everybody, Aaron Walther here, just reminding you that if you like this podcast, please subscribe to the channel. Also, head over to secondthoughtcomics.com to stay up to date on the various comics that I write. For a limited time, I'm giving away a free PDF of my latest graphic novel, The Amoral Stingray. All you have to do is sign up to the Second Thought Comics newsletter. Link is in the description. Thanks for reading.